The world is changing faster than ever. Only a few years ago, one may have said a third world war is impossible. Yet after the past year or so, I'm sure many of you now think otherwise. Since the end of World War II, arguably even World War I, the United States has ruled the world. It has been able to influence geopolitics globally, with resources to fight in any relevant proxy war it pleases. It had, and still has, a massive selection of strong allies, willing to do as they say at a moment's notice, all while their country is left virtually unscathed due to its supreme geography. But over the last 80 years, the economic growth of the US and its allies has begun to plateau, while the rival powers have emerged from the ashes of World War II. In 2024, the US is as challenged as it has ever been, with forces approaching that could put an end to its unipolar dominance. I'm talking about the Moscow-Beijing-Tehran axis, a tripartite of natural adversaries to the US. They and their proxies aim to chip away at the American sphere of influence and send them back to the Americas. A complex, multi-front chess match is quickly unfolding for the dominance over Eurasia, and in 2024, things will continue to heat up. In this video, we will focus on the situation in Europe and what I predict to happen in 2024. Europe as it stands. We are currently witnessing a chess match between the USA and the Moscow-Beijing-Tehran axis. More generally, we are witnessing a conflict between the dominant power over the last century, the United States, and several rising powers. The latter primarily includes the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Russian Federation, and the Chinese Communist Party. Individually, these governments cannot expect to oppose the US, with the exception of maybe China. However, together, they initiate a complex, multi-front operation to break the American hold on various regions in Eurasia. They aim to stretch American forces around the world and slowly chip away at its sphere of influence. Europe is the US's most powerful bridgehead on the continent of Eurasia. In this region, and possibly globally, the main adversary is the Russian Federation. Despite what many analysts say, this is not some immature conflict based on past rivalries. The US and Russia are natural adversaries. Due to geography, both sides vie for trade dominance over Europe. Currently, the US holds an extremely strong position in Europe. Many of the ex-communist nations joined NATO after the fall of the USSR. Even worse for Russia, when the Ukraine conflicts began in 2014, the US government decided to firmly side with the Ukrainian government, while Russia inevitably backed pro-Russian separatists in Donbass and Crimea. The seeds were sown for a direct proxy war with Russia and the US via Ukraine. Despite the difference in GDP, Russia still holds massive geographic leverage over the US in regards to Europe, able to supply energy and minerals for a far cheaper price. Russia should not be underestimated by the US as an adversary, and the US knows this. After the opening of front lines in the Middle East, Africa, and possibly East Asia in the future, the US will become increasingly distracted. If they are not careful, European countries may begin to turn their backs on the US and seek neutrality or even alliance with Russia. Equally, a firm Russian defeat here could mean a serious fracturing and weakening of the Russian state, making it vulnerable to European, Central Asian, and Chinese influence. Ukraine. Ukraine is the most important area to watch in Europe at the moment. Everything is on the line in this conflict. It is practically a real war between Russia and NATO, except for the involvement of NATO manpower, at least for now. A decisive Russian victory here will send a geopolitical shockwave through the entirety of Europe, and in turn, the world. Both sides are experiencing colossal casualties. It is very hard for us to predict the actual numbers, as pro-Western and pro-Russian sources report completely different figures, and both are likely heavily exaggerated. So who's winning? The best way to determine who is winning in this conflict is to consider the remaining resources and future logistics of each side. The fact is, Russia is in a much better position on this front in the long term. 2023 showed this, with both sides firmly dug in on their territory, with extensive fortifications. Large-scale operations to take territory and claim immediate victories are practically impossible at this time. Both sides are so good at war now that multi-million-dollar tanks and armed vehicles barely make it to the front line before being decimated by kamikaze drones. Both sides can strike at forces and equipment hundreds of miles from the front line with pinpoint accuracy. So, the war has become a battle of attrition. For either side to win, they must completely destroy the other's military resources and manpower. Of course, it is extremely challenging to calculate exactly what each side has, as media on both sides lies about troop losses. However, multiple articles from either side suggest Ukraine's Soviet military resources are almost completely expended, meaning it is almost completely reliant on Western aid. This is a dangerous situation, as if these countries are distracted by other conflicts around the world, Ukraine may no longer be a priority. In the near future, the strongest US allies in Europe are likely to continue arming Ukraine. However, this is only if these governments remain intact. More on this later in the video. For Ukraine, this lack of reliability is extremely problematic, as it means Ukraine needs to continually convince these governments they are a worthwhile investment. To do this, Ukraine needs immediate victories. This is best done, obviously, by success on the battlefield and humiliation of Russia. But as we said, this is impossible without a massive advantage in resources over Russia, which requires Western aid. Ukraine basically needs to keep winning on the map to keep being able to fight. Because of Ukraine's size, it is extremely vulnerable to Russian drone and missile strikes, so it is extremely challenging to set up domestic production. All in all, Ukraine needs to hope some European nations make a massive gamble and send everything they can to Ukraine. This is why we see Zelensky constantly travelling around the world, trying to get any aid he can, wherever he can. However, even this is unlikely to be enough, as militarily Europe is very weak and lacks the infrastructure to produce equipment and ammunition anywhere near the rate of Russia. Furthermore, the main industrial powerhouse, Germany, is experiencing an energy crisis due to the cutting off of gas supplies from, you guessed it, Russia. You may wonder why I don't mention the US in this discussion. Realistically, only the US has the military resources to counter Russia. But, as I'm sure you know, the US has bigger obligations elsewhere in the world. Isn't it funny that the conflict in Israel was initiated by Iranian-backed militias, right after the end of the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive? Now, the US is tied down in the Middle East and unlikely to prioritize Ukraine. This could explain why Ukraine is launching bizarre raids, such as the bridgehead on Krinky, which is costing massive resources, as a desperate attempt to claim some kind of media victory, likely using amphibious equipment intended for the summer offensive. The best option for Ukraine now is to defend and drain Russia's resources as much as possible in the hopes that the US can refocus on Ukraine in the future. The extensive fortifications all along the front line are Ukraine's best advantage and can at least slow down the Russian progress. The manpower situation is also becoming more difficult. There are no longer lines of Ukrainians signing up to fight, so military officials have no choice but to mobilize in a more forceful manner. There are now frequent reports of Ukrainian militias consisting of only women, even. How long Ukraine can keep mobilizing is unclear, but again, Russia's advantage in this category is becoming clear. Russia, on the other hand, still has the possibility to mobilize up to 20 million soldiers, and hardly even bothered mobilizing more in 2023. Most of its growth is apparently due to volunteers, which, given its size, isn't unfeasible. On the ground in 2024, we will see a continuation of Russian tactics and a further weakening of Ukraine. Russia is currently launching a broad offensive consisting of recon groups and massive artillery and drone strikes. The main goal is not necessarily to take territory, but to destroy the Ukrainian army as efficiently as possible, by creating cordons around major fortifications. This is what was done in Bakhmut in 2023, and is a winning formula for Russia, because Ukraine is forced to rely on its media image, and wants to keep as much territory as possible in order to encourage Western supplies. A similar operation is currently unfolding in Avdiivka, a major Ukrainian stronghold next to Donetsk. Russians managed to form significant flanks around the city, giving them fire control over the roads to this fortress. In 2024, expect similar situations to unfold near Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region, Siversk and Chasiv Yar. Nevertheless, these offensives are still expensive for Russia. Ukraine's biggest advantage is its fortifications, which have proven very effective and take months for the Russians to break with artillery. With continued mobilization and some European funding, Ukraine can defend successfully for a while longer, at least for the majority of 2024. In fact, I expect the Ukrainians to launch another offensive this year, with everything they can muster, likely in the same directions as in summer 2023. There are rumours of major aid packages from Germany, France and the UK. To be honest, I doubt this will go much differently to the 2023 counteroffensive, as aid is unlikely to be as huge in total, and Russia continues to increase production. Due to Russia's geography, it is extremely difficult for Ukraine to largely disable Russian production, as it's just too huge. Even Ukraine itself is too huge for Russia to locate all of Ukraine's supplies, so imagine trying to locate everything in Russia. I expect Ukraine to launch a significant partisan operation on Russian territory, where they could at least disable military infrastructure for a brief period, however, and then strike as hard as possible on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Russia will continue to grind all over the front line and slowly pick off weakening Ukraine defences. I think that it is too early to talk about any large movements on the map, however. To summarise, the war is far from over, but unless NATO intervenes directly, there is minimal chance of the US maintaining influence over much of Ukraine, unless Russia makes a major military blunder. The Caucasus. The next area of importance is the border between Europe and Asia. It is the essential trade route between Russia and Iran, and eventually the Indian Ocean. In September 2023, Azerbaijan won the war of Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian separatist region near the Armenian border. Over 100,000 ethnic Armenians have left the region since. Armenia is in an extremely difficult situation. The only thing stopping Azerbaijan previously was Russian peacekeepers and the CSTO alignment of Armenia. However, Azerbaijan has become increasingly friendly towards Russia and Iran. Russia is still allied with Armenia technically, but now it doesn't care enough to take a firm stance against Azerbaijan. Armenia has since reached out to the US and Europe. The reason these countries don't reach out to Armenia is because supplying it is next to impossible. Turkey strongly supports Azerbaijan for cultural reasons, and would never agree to siding with Armenia. The only option for supplies is via Georgia. Russia already controls half of Georgia's coastline, and the Black Sea is a danger zone at the moment. You'll have fun trying to ship Western aid through this region, with Turkey and Russia opposing you. Therefore, Azerbaijan has massive leverage over Armenia at the moment, and if they don't do what the Azeris want, may begin carving off areas of Armenia. This could easily get as brutal as Israel-Palestine, as it's likely that the Azeris will seek to ethnically cleanse any territories they capture to prevent any partisan activity. This is likely to start with the Zangezur corridor between Azeri territories. We hope that it does not come to this, but the situation is extremely dangerous. Pashinyan has already angered his people greatly for the surrender of Nagorno-Karabakh, so surrendering this area without a fight would likely lead to major political uprisings in Armenia. Equally, an armed conflict would be extremely brutal for Armenia. It would likely at least anger the Russians as fellow Orthodox Christians, who would at a minimum push for a ceasefire, who the Azeris still need to keep happy. The West may even try to fund Armenia, despite the risks, but this would be an awful tactical decision, as Armenia, as well as Georgia, would likely be attacked from all sides and completely destroyed. Furthermore, Turkey would probably want to completely distance itself from NATO in this scenario. A Turkey friendly to Moscow and Tehran could be the final nail in the coffin for US interests in the Middle East and Europe. Watch this area closely in 2024. Serbia and Kosovo. The final area of major conflict in Europe is in the Balkans. Serbia is another natural ally to Russia and firmly hates the West. It seeks to retake separatist Kosovo territory, ideally unification with Republika Srpska territory in Bosnia. Equally, Kosovans want to kick out all ethnic Serbs from their territory. In 2022, events transpired in Kosovan favour, with increased aggression towards ethnic Serbs on its territory. The Serbian leader Vučić even proclaimed support for Ukraine. This clearly aligned with Russian failures on the battlefield. However, Serbia has survived since. If Russia conquers the rest of Ukraine, some of Serbia's neighbours are likely to seek relations with Russia, which may allow the Russians to directly supply Serbs and allow them to become increasingly aggressive again. Both sides know this, so expect Kosovans to continue aggression towards any Serbs on its territory. In 2024, with the weakening of Ukraine, they may take aggressive action to prevent a Serbian incursion later down the line. This is a drastic option, but the situation is unpredictable here. At the minimum, I expect major protests and conflict this year. Another Balkan war is very possible in the coming years. Rest of Eastern Europe. Though these areas are unlikely to be involved in a major conflict this year, this is a key area of conflict for the future. You can think of these as swing states. In this video, we already assume that Russia will become increasingly successful in Ukraine according to the war of attrition and US distraction elsewhere. In these territories, I'll explain the knock-on effect of this progression. First is Finland, who should be included in this category, as it is in a similar situation as the rest of Eastern Europe. Finland joined NATO in 2022, and is a great position for the US. In the future, it could be the US's trump card in stopping Russia expand its sphere of influence. In 2024, Finland has a presidential election, but regardless of the outcome, this is unlikely to have any major effects on the country's policies. The Finns party, a Eurosceptic, right-wing populist party, is worth watching in the future, however, as they are gradually growing in popularity. A major victory in 2024 remains unlikely, however. Nonetheless, if in power, they may limit Western aid to Ukraine. Next is the Baltic states. These states are extremely vulnerable to Russia, and are also in NATO. There are presidential and parliamentary elections in Lithuania this year. Expect a social democratic victory and a continuation of previous policy. If Russia takes over Ukraine, Russia and allied Belarus will obtain even greater leverage over this region, and may become aggressive towards these states if they don't do what they say, such as dealing with the connection to Kaliningrad and Russian minorities in these states. Next, we move to the Visegrad states. This is the key staging ground for future anti-Western policy if Russia succeeds in Ukraine. Hungary is the most pro-Russian, with Viktor Orban repeatedly opposing and vetoing Ukrainian aid from Europe. The most notable shift is in Slovakia, who aided Ukraine initially. Newly elected Robert Fico takes a stance as strong as Orban's, and completely cut off aid from Slovakia. Thirdly, it's Poland, who is a major wildcard here. Despite vocally being extremely pro-Ukraine initially, in late 2023, protesters blocked aid going to Ukraine over a grain dispute. Donald Tusk, a known globalist, was elected over previous President Duda in December, however, so an anti-Russian sentiment is likely to remain in the government for the time being. In 2024, expect more anti-Western actions in these countries. The other reason I singled out these countries is because of what happens regarding Ukrainian territory in a Russian victory. One possibility is that these countries try to annex border regions in western Ukraine. Volyn and Lviv could go to Poland, while Zakarpattia could go to Hungary or Slovakia. The Russians could exchange these territories for good terms with these nations. Alternatively, their militaries will storm in and capture them as the Ukrainian army breaks to limit the Russian advance. Again, this is at least a year down the line yet. Next is Moldova, who already has a Russian headache regarding Transnistria. If Russia makes it to Odessa, Moldova is also not in NATO, so Russia may as well just go ahead and annex the entire thing. This is a country with 300,000 people, and cannot join NATO due to the Transnistria situation. Russia will definitely annex Transnistria, and only allow independence for the rest of Moldova if called in Samothrace. In 2024, it's highly unlikely that Russia will make it to the other side of the Dnieper. I think that Moldova missed its best chance to take action on Transnistria in 2022, when the Russians were weakest militarily. One solution is to unify Romania. An option to do this cleanly is to leave Transnistria independent. However, Moldovan residents do not necessarily want this, as seen in the Gaugauz election in 2022. Maia Sandu is very pro-NATO, however, and may seek to force this through if possible. This could happen this year, if pro-Moldovan politicians can be convinced. There is also a presidential election this year, where Sandu will be challenged, but poll-wise looks likely to remain in power. Romania is in a similar situation to the Visegrad nations, and could also swing towards a neutral stance with Russia in the future. The region of Chernovitzy in Ukraine could be given in exchange for an alliance. Again, don't expect any of this yet, at least not until the Russians reach western Ukraine, if that happens at all. We also need to mention Belarus. This nation is practically an extension of Russia, and is essential territory for Russia. There is a parliamentary election this year, and expect major pro-Western protests, like in 2020. It's hard to tell exactly how large these will be, as Lukashenko cracked down heavily on these guys then, but expect the government to be tested once again. Finally is Russia itself. Russia has a presidential election this year. There are several candidates, including Lavrov, Shoigu, Mishustin, and of course Putin. Putin is almost guaranteed victory here. An extremely unlikely occurrence that he steps down, however. Expect a more nationalist leader to arise, who may seek more aggressive geopolitical actions in the future. Putin is a moderate choice compared to most of these guys. Western Europe. Now we move to Western Europe. This will be another interesting year for this entire region, as populations become increasingly polarized between supporting the ruling elites and uprising populist movements. The intensification of the demographic issue continues, as well as drastic globalist austerity taken against certain industries in these nations. In late 2023, we saw the first major casualty in Mark Rutte's government in the Netherlands, where Geert Wilders won the general election. Mark Rutte's government had increasingly pushed against the farming industry, which was likely a major contribution for this shift. This is a big move for the Netherlands, but I doubt for it to have any major effect for now, as alone this nation cannot oppose the policies of the EU, and is too tied to US influence as is. I expect it to continue aid to Ukraine too. The globalist policy continues in much of Western Europe, however. The policy from the likes of Macron and Scholz will lead to protests from farmers and factory workers. There are some minor elections in Germany too, where we can expect a surge in popularity in the AfD party. Essentially, expect globalist policies to annoy more people and lead to an increase in protests all over Western Europe. However, there are no major elections this year. It's also worth mentioning the European elections. This could be a very interesting event, as support of populist policies has soared to new heights over the last few years. The most populist EU council ever could be elected, headed by the ID party, which could cause chaos in the ranks of the Social Democratic and centre-right parties. For the sake of this video, we also need to touch on the US. I will do a future video going into detail on this, but it needs to be mentioned in this context. To be clear, the 2024 US election could be the difference between a world war starting and it not, and massively affect who is allied with who. It will likely end up in a competition between Biden and Trump. I would predict Trump to win personally, but to be clear, each administration has alternate geopolitical strategies, and a very difficult task regarding the Eurasian supercontinent. The predictions in this video are based on the current US policy under the Democrat regime, which will continue until at least the end of this year. However, Trump coming in 2025 would almost completely change the current picture. Trump would be happy to tilt Europe back towards Russia and vice versa, pull out of the Middle East where possible, and focus completely on weakening China. In Europe, this basically means allowing for gas trade between Germany and Russia again, peace in Ukraine, and neutrality between Eastern Europe and Russia. In a future video, I'll go into detail about the geopolitical and social strategy of the Trump administration in comparison to the Democrats. Both strategies have pros and cons, and are far more complex than one may think. Nonetheless, nothing new until 2025. Summary. Expect Russian progress in Ukraine. Expect escalation in the Caucasus and possibly the Balkans. Expect an increasing political shift towards neutrality of Russia in Eastern Europe, and a shift towards populism and anti-globalist policy in Western Europe. I hope you found this video informative. Thank you very much for watching. If I missed anything, or you disagree with anything I've said, let me know in the comments section. I aim to follow this up over the coming months with similar videos on the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and the Americas.